Well, I'm glad you heard the alarm and you read that it's an extreme advanced level of difficulty, and that it is. Let's get started with the list of items that we'll look at in this video. We have a custom portrait. We have joints that we dremeled out, a sculpt on the chest. We have the ball joints that we had to sand down, and a cape we had to attach that was provided by the customer. Now we also went into a primer that needed its dry time. That Vallejo primer does not dry instantly. We have a custom belt, we'll see at the end, custom emblem, and we have spacers on the ball joints at the ankles. And we had some more dry time on the glue. So just to be advised, we have a lot to take care of, to look at in this video. So if there's something that you missed, definitely rewind it, go back to that point and look at it again so you can understand how it was done. Just want to take the time to remind you that like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. We're approaching 2,000 subscribers. The first step is to disassemble your figure, and if you need any information as to how to disassemble it, there is a separate video on that. You do want to remove the emblem from the chest. It is a sculpt that is actually embedded in there, and you can just resculpt the chest using apoxie sculpt so that you have the actual proportions correct. You can refer to a different figure, and you have to allow it to dry at least 24 hours for it to truly be workable. We are going to attach the head. This one is purchased on eBay out of China. We're going to add some epoxy and attach the head itself. I've already done this for video purposes. What you do is fill it in at the bottom. Only fill it enough to cover that ball peg. Do not fill it all the way to the edge. Once it's hardened for about 20 minutes, you can dismount it off of the peg and then push in lightly at the edges so that it creates a tighter tension when you put it back in there, and that way it stays in snug, and there you go. Then you just leave it dry for at least 24 hours. It says 4 hours, but technically if you let it go for 24 hours, it'll be rock hard. We're going to be using the Vallejo white primer. I ended up using most of this bottle because doing a color change on this particular figure, having it go from purple to bright yellow, that took a lot of layers, not only primer, but layers of paint. So we're going to start off with the head and the torso together. Since we've got them attached, as you can see, I've already taped off the neck area that is going to stay in a skin tone, and then we'll paint that in a blue. And we're lightly adding layers of primer over not only the portrait, but the actual torso. Now, as you can tell, I am not adding primer to the ball joint or the socket area for the shoulders. Only the actual piece on the exterior. You do not want any paint in there. Besides, we're going to be dremeling out those sockets so that it does not have any paint rub on those butterfly joints, those round discs that go in between the shoulder and the arm. So we want to make sure that all of that is taken care of before we add any paint. Now, anything on the chest that you've sculpted and on the back, as you can tell, the primer is going to pick up if there's any defects. So you definitely want to let the primer dry at least 4 hours so that you can go back in there, re-sand it, and then polish it out and re-primer the surface. And then of course you can paint it. So Allow a dry time of 4 hours for the primer to truly be dry before you work on it. If you can let it dry for that much longer, even better, because it will truly be a workable surface. If you start working on it within the hour, you're going to find that it's tacky, it is easy to come off, and it doesn't sand very well. It will actually gum up your sandpaper, and you'll see it start to tear off in different layers. So the portrait itself consists of 4 different colors of skin tone, and the same for the hair. And once I had that in there, I went ahead and sealed it. One of the tools you're going to use quite often on this project is a Dremel. If you do not have one, I'd recommend you get one, or you're going to have to use sandpaper or a file very carefully. But you want to Dremel off the sculpting that is on the boots. Once you have that done, you can sand it down to a nice polished finish. Now, unfortunately here you have 2 different materials. You have a harder plastic and a softer plastic, and you will see a difference in how the Dremel works on each of those 2 surfaces. So very carefully you want to erase that bottom red sculpt and blend it in as best as possible into the purple. Then when you take your sandpaper, you can go ahead and sand it down to a polished finish. You will still have a seam, but it's only because you have 2 different materials together. This is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like now, and of course you want to do the same to both to have a matching set. Now we're going to go into a different tool for your Dremel. If you go to Harbor Freight, you can find these engravers, and they're used for engraving onto metal or glass, etc. But they work so well for sanding down tight spots. Now they're about $10 for this set of 12 different pieces. Choose the one that you think is best for your project, and you can sand down the joints on your figure. Unfortunately, for this particular figure, this was not enough. The challenge here was to take the entire joint apart and get into the actual pieces. Now, unfortunately, with the Mcfarlane figures, you have ratchets, as I am pointing out here. Now, there's not only ratchets on the actual joint, but on the inside, the matching set of those ratchets. You're gonna have to Dremel out the first 2 ratchets on the inside joint on both the front and the back, top and bottom. The reason is, that is what is gonna cause the major significant paint rub on those areas. Now I did do some painting to see how much of a paint rub I was going to have, and yes, I had to remove the joints, removing those pins. You heat them up in hot water, or you can use a hair dryer, and this is what the actual mechanism looks on the inside. You've got the ratchet on the edge. You also have ratchet marks on the edges, on the sides. You only want to Dremel out or grind down the smooth areas, not the ratcheted areas. You're gonna have to go down at least 1/8 of an inch for it to have a clearance on those areas. Do not grind or sand down the flat surfaces. Make sure you do a test fit every time that you finish dremeling a joint, because you will need to make sure that it is a smooth transition or fitting and that it's not snagging anywhere. Do not sand down the flat surfaces on the sides, only the areas that are contoured. And you're gonna have to do it over and over until you get it right. So it doesn't just happen on the first try. You may have to go down even deeper depending on that joint. Now, the only two pieces of the ratchet you want to actually Dremel off are on inside the actual piece where the joint meets. So where those pins go in, there's ratchets beneath those. Only the first two ratchets on the ends, the front and back, top and bottom, is what you want to remove. Otherwise, you will have a paint rub no matter how much you sand it. So as soon as you have everything taken down to its maximum actual grinding point, that you don't get into the actual ratchet, then you very lightly coat it with your primer. Let it dry, use a hair dryer to speed up the process, and then paint it lightly. Allow that paint and primer to dry at least 4 hours before adding another coat. If you work on it while it's still wet and reassemble it, the paint's going to come off. It has to adhere to the plastic. This is the longest wait of the project. So these boots do not have a seam around them like the Superman boots. They come to a point on the Superman boots. So we need to cover the old seam with the new one. And looking at the references, his boot is a straight seam all the way around. So the best way to do that is to flatten out a piece of epoxy. And the epoxy is a two-part combination, and it is a water-soluble substance. So to smooth it out after you've positioned it around the calf or in the boot area, you can take your finger with a little bit of water and then pull down the epoxy and smooth it out to a fine finish. And if you want to go any deeper or smooth it out even more, you can use a tool like a shaping tool like this one. Get it wet and smooth it out as best as possible. You're going to have to repeat the same for the wrists where the gloves are going. And again, there is kind of a tricky here because the forearm or these arms are actually kind of short, and it's going to be smaller gloves. You don't want to put it onto the joint itself because you don't want to break up the sculpt. So you just want to roll out a little thin spaghetti so you can apply it easily, and then do the same with a little bit of water. Take your finger and smooth it out as best as possible, and then let it dry for 4 hours, and it can go even more. The more time you let it dry, the better it is, because it'll be hardened and easy to sand, and it's going to be that much better to work with. Once it's finished, then you polish it out to a high gloss smooth finish so that it can easily take the primer and it'll look like a factory sculpt. your epoxy is dry on the legs and the arms, this is what it should look like after you finish sanding it. A high gloss, smooth finish if you sand it with a 1200 grit sandpaper. You can go higher if you want. The whole point is to have it smooth. Have no seams or ridges visible. If there are any, the primer is going to pick it up and it's going to show you where you need to go back and resand. So here's the arm, and we've got to make it look just the same. So now it's time to replace those pins where they belong. You can only heat the limbs, do not heat the peg. While the limbs are still hot, use a blunt object like a dowel or the back of a screwdriver and push the pin all the way into its place while the limbs are still warm. The thing to keep in mind is do not paint the joints, especially here on the shoulder and the bicep. Make sure there's no paint whatsoever on the ball joint or on that socket. Great, we made it to the paint booth. Now, the important thing is to get the shadows down first. Holding it at an angle and spraying it with a dark brown only to cause a natural shadow. It's going to hit the relief areas on the sculpt only. Do not spray it directly. Have it at an angle so that it creates that natural shadow. Now once you have that and it's fully dry, you can use a hair dryer to do so. You're going to cover it, and it may take you 4 layers of that yellow paint. That brown will then become a different tone, causing it to look like a shadow, and it's going to look that much nicer instead of you going back in and trying to paint those tones of shadowing underneath it. So again, it is acrylic. It is not going to cover on the first pass. You are going to give it at least 4 layers of color. And that's also going to depend on the paint brand that you have. But again, take a look. We are not painting the sockets where the shoulders or arms are going into. Only the surface that is going to be visible. So we're not done painting yet. We've only finished one color. Now after we've let it dry for at least 4 hours or longer if needed, depending on the paint you're using and the temperature in the area, now we're going to remask it to paint the blues. And the blue we're starting with is the one on the collar. This is where the cape is going to match and meet up with. So again, we've remasked everything just to make sure we only paint the collar. So be very, very careful how you mask it, because any overspray is going to damage your work on the yellow paint. Make sure you remask all of the areas around the limbs, the gloves, and the boots, and only paint the areas that are going to be blue. we've reached the tricky part of this project, and that is the ankle joints. You want to fold that peg to be able to grasp it tightly and be able to sand it. You can't Dremel these at all. The Dremel will just chew them up. Sanding is the best way to do it. It's going to take you a while, so make some time for it. As you can see, I've already done so, and now I am going to drill out the end of each peg with a 5/64 bit and put in an extension. Now that extension is so that it does not hit the other surface, because the paint rub will still happen if it touches the surface on the inside of the leg and the actual foot. So this tiny little bit of extension, and I added a small toothpick to extend it on both ends, will keep it from touching and avoid that paint rub. Once you've got it taken care of, you want to lightly coat it with your primer. You want to lightly coat it with paint, layer upon layer until you build up your surface, and allow it to dry with enough time, at least 4 hours, because you're gonna have to come back and reattach it to the boot and to the actual leg. And once you do so, you want to make sure that those are actually heated, not the peg. Hold the foot with a cloth and then reattach the peg into it, and then while holding that cloth and the foot with the peg, attach it to the leg. That way you don't have your fingerprints all over it, and then you've got paint coming off because you've rubbed it with the oils on your hand. Be very, very careful when you reattach it. Heat the leg and reattach holding the foot with the cloth. So we made it to the cape install. Now this cape I did not make. This was provided by the client who wanted this custom project. So we need a 24 gauge wire and we need some pliers to cut it and shape it. We're gonna make a hook. We're going to attach that hook to the cape and then attach it to the neck area. We are not gonna dig into the neck and then cram the cape in there. We're just gonna hook right into the other wire that's already set into the cape. That way we can very easily manipulate it into the area that we want to attach it onto the chest. Now once you set it through, remember this wire is very sharp, but once you set it through there, you take your pliers and then you join it together by crimping it. And that's it. There's no science to it. Now we drill out 2 tiny holes about the same width of the wire, and now we fill it in with glue. I'm using Gorilla Glue because I want this to stay in there permanently. I don't want it coming out at all. So you fill it in as much as you can with that Gorilla Glue, and then put in those 2 pins on each side. Let it set for 24 hours. Use the excess wire to fill in with the glue, so you make use of everything that you've got. Once you've attached it on there, you want to tape it down so that it stays in place. So fitting one side and then fitting the other, and then attaching it with tape so that it holds down in place, letting it dry for 24 hours. Once that is dry, you take your Fabri-Tac glue and then you glue the cape down to the shoulder area. A small bead is all you need. Wait till it's tacky, fold it over, and done. Your cape should look like this on your figure with your painted boots and your gloves and the painted briefs, which were at one point bright red. So we're still not finished. We have the last part of this, which is the custom belt. And there's a lot of ways to draw out this emblem. I just had to choose one of them. So yes, I had to draw it out first, measure it out, make sure that it's the right size for the actual belt, and then I had to cut it out. And I traced it out first with a black ink pen so that I can actually cut out the emblem, because we want to make a 3D emblem. It could be very easily done with a printer and just slap it on there, a wet decal, but that really wouldn't be enough for me. I need to make this emblem out of epoxy, and for that I need a template. So I have to make my own template. I don't have a Cricut cutter to do it for me. So this is what you do old school. You cut out your template by hand using an X-Acto knife after you've drawn in your lines, and then placing it over the epoxy, cutting it out, and letting it dry. So once you've cut up the belt, you can take your epoxy and place it underneath your pattern, and you want to flatten it out first so that it stays in one thickness all the way around, and then just take a sharp knife, cut one end and then the other, and then you can remove your pattern from the top. It should come off as one piece. If it doesn't, replace it and make your cuts a little bit cleaner. And then allow it to stay on the acetate or the plastic that you're cutting. In this case, what I'm cutting here, that's where it's going to stay until it's fully dry. It's going to take roughly 4 hours. I let it go for at least 10 hours because I was working on other projects. Now once your emblem is fully dry, you want to sand it down as best as possible, polish it out with a 1200 grit sandpaper so it's nice and smooth and glossy, and then you come back and hit it with the primer and with the paint. And of course you'll use a few layers of paint and then make it really glossy with an X22 Tamiya clear coat. So we're not finished yet. We still have to work on the actual belt. And we're going to use worbola. And this is a heat activated material. So we can actually make the correct curvature that we need all the way around the waist on the figure. Now it is easiest to work with this for what we're doing while it's cooled down. So we need to cut a straight edge on those edges there with the ruler, and then the curved area I ended up cutting with a pair of scissors. If you work on this while it's heated and you're trying to make the cut, yeah, it'll cut easier. However, it becomes sticky and you can actually deform the piece if you apply too much pressure one way or the other. So it's easiest to work on it while it's cool and then heat it to make the form that you need. once it's cut, I want to fit it to the figure and actually cut in excess of it, so in case I need to trim it down, I have plenty of excess to work with. But we're going to use this on an extra or spare body so that we don't mess with the figure too much and start rubbing paint off on different areas. So using an extra body, we're only going to make the actual shape. Then we'll fit it to the actual figure. And this is just so we can get a better hold on things and measure things out and where we're going to cut excess and make it fit together. Now the nice thing about worbola is you don't need any glue. It will actually stick to itself once you've heated it. You press it together with some flat pliers and that's it. Let it cool and it is stuck together. So I added a few tape marks to make sure that I have the correct area that I'm going to cut into, and then I want to hold it in place. And once I've marked it, I'm going to go ahead and cut it and then join it together with some heat. No glue required. So worbola cools down very quickly after you work with it. And in the meantime, while it cools down, just want to figure out what areas we need to sand before we attach it to the actual figure, of course before we paint it. And then trying out to see how the emblem is going to fit that we cut and painted earlier. Now the edges have been cleaned, sanded off the back, and trimmed it down. Now it's time to paint it. Down to the final stretch of this project, attaching the emblem to the belt. Once the belt is fully dry, it's been clear coated, etc. If you've got a vise like this or some other device that can help you hold the belt while you attach the emblem, definitely use it. It'll make it that much easier. Attaching it with just a little bit of Fabri-Tac glue on the back so that it doesn't ooze out at the edges and it holds firm wherever you place it. That's it. Once you've got this done, let it dry for at least 4 hours and then attach it to the briefs on the figure. Let that dry for another 4 hours and reassemble your figure. So let's take a look at the finished product and the list of items that we looked at in the video. We have a custom portrait. We Dremeled out the joints. And we have a sculpted chest. And we have the ball joints that were sanded down, and of course attaching a cape that was prefabricated. Now we also have given the primer enough dry time so that we can work with it. A custom belt that you just viewed along with that custom emblem, and of course you saw that there were spacers on the ball joints for the ankles, and giving the glue enough dry time as well. And keep in mind that all of the contents in this video are an extreme level of difficulty. It takes a lot of time to get this project done. It took me roughly 2 weeks to get it done because of dry time and wait time for that to be workable, and of course all the sanding and then all the touch-ups I had to do here and there. But in the meantime, please for now, keep customizing those figures, and of course, enjoy the rest of this video clip of the finished product.